going to go ahead and turn that on. Also, if I can ask you, I see a lot of folks are already doing that, putting into the chat who they are, where they're from, and maybe also if you could put into the chat what you're teaching, if you're a studio teacher, if you're a classroom teacher, and what it is that you teach. It'd be great to get a sense of the 108 people and counting on this webinar. So you are muted, and we'll go ahead. You do have the ability, and we're going to try to have Jennifer talk for about 40 minutes. And then after that, there'll be some time for Q&A. And you will have the ability at that time, if you like to, and if you're called upon, to unmute. But I think the easiest thing with a group this size is to go ahead and have you, when you're ready, put your questions in the chat area. I'm going to go ahead and monitor the chat throughout the webinar, and then I will lift to Jennifer any specific questions that come up, and then she will, maybe if you need more clarification, she'll call on you to unmute yourself. Most webinars don't have groups this big on them, but I think Jennifer felt like with a group this size, with body mapping being the topic, it is really important sometimes to be able to see the person who's asking the questions. And so we thought we would try this little bit unwieldy, large size webinar in this format. So bear with us, and it should be okay. So just a couple of other odds and ends. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Jennifer and her. First of all, Jennifer lives in St. John's, Newfoundland, which is in the upper far east north part of Canada. She began her career there in 1993 when she accepted a position as principal second violin in the Newfoundland Symphony Orchestra and second violin of the Atlantic String Quartet. During her 12 years playing with the Atlantic String Quartet, she performed regularly with artists of international acclaim, including the Christoph Penderecki, Dennis Brott, Patrick Galois, Rivka Golani, and Anton Querty. And in addition to her performing career, she has a well-established reputation as a pedagogue in St. John's. Throughout her career, she's been dedicated to the advancement of music education, specifically through the Suzuki Talent Education Program of St. John's, of which she served as the artistic director from 1998 to 2002. In 2004, a generous grant from the Canadian Council for the Arts funded a 7-month Alexander Technique sabbatical for Jennifer, which permitted her to study throughout Europe and the United States with many of the world's leading Alexander Technique teachers. Some of these teachers included Pedro de Alcantara, Walter Carrington, Marjorie Barlow, Joan and Alexander Murray, and Barbara Conable. Jennifer went on to train with Barbara Conable, and in 2005 became Canada's first licensed Andover educator. She now presents body mapping workshops internationally, working with musicians who are interested in learning to enhance their musical ability and to prevent injury through a clear understanding of how their bodies are designed to move. Jennifer's book, What Every Violinist Needs to Know About the Body, was published in 2009, published by GIA Publications. It was translated into Japanese and published in Japan in 2011. She also has published another book with GIA about body mapping for children. So those working with young people can learn some of those techniques as well. And as I was thinking about what we can do in this era of distance learning, what can be helpful for folks, there's no question in my mind that a lot of the ideas of body mapping are as relevant or more important than ever before. And so that's why we asked Jennifer to go ahead and lead this webinar. So just again, we're going to start with about a 40-minute introduction, and there'll be time for Q&A at the end. And one other thing, on the GIA website, and I'll also post into the chat, there's a page of all of our body mapping resources. And those who are interested, I'm going to post a coupon code, but all lowercase BodyMap 2020. And that'll be for 10% off on any of the body mapping resources that GIA publishes. So with all of that, I turn everything over to Jennifer.
Thank you, Alec. I want to thank GIA for suggesting this and hosting it. It's a real honor and privilege to be able to do this. So we'll just launch right in. As Alec mentioned, a lot of this is going to be a slide presentation. So I'm going to be sharing some slides with you. And the first 3 or 4 are just going to give you a little bit of a background, a little bit of history about body mapping, where it came from, and just so there's some context before we go into the content of today's chat. So we're calling it Using Body Mapping to Improve Your Virtual Music Teaching. We're all coming up against lots of challenges in this interesting time. So I just wanted to share with you a few of the thoughts I've had over the last 6 weeks about how body mapping can help. A little bit of background though. The few little highlights I'm going to be giving you today are drawn from a fantastic course called What Every Musician Needs to Know About the Body. It was created by my teacher, Barbara Conable, who is now retired, but is an Alexander Technique teacher. Sometime in the early 90s, when she and Bill were married, they were living in, she and Bill Conable were both, by the way, he's also an Alexander Technique teacher. They were living in Columbus, Ohio, and he was working with a violinist, and the violinist had a very stiff bow arm, and he had tried several different ways of trying to free this up for her. And finally, he said to her, can you just point to where you think your elbow is? And she pointed about an inch higher than where the actual joint was. And he thought, well, now that's interesting. Didn't know that was possible. So he got out the arm model and he showed her exactly where that bending joint is for the elbow, movement of bowing. And she found it on herself with some guidance from him. And she said, oh, well, that's easy. I can do that. And proceeded to play with a much freer bow arm. So that was the beginning of body mapping. That was really when the penny dropped that both music learning and Alexander Technique could go a lot faster if we could overcome some of these seemingly strange misconceptions that it turns out a lot of us carry about how our body is designed to move. So that was Bill's initial discovery, and then Barbara kind of took it and ran with it, and being the very wise woman that she is, she wrote some very compassionate books about it, and I met her at the end of that sabbatical that Alec had mentioned, and it just kind of changed my world and certainly saved my career because I was in deep injury at that point. So it helps people prevent injury in their music studios, but today we're going to be talking more about just how it can accommodate us all when we're faced with these challenges of distance learning. So Barbara went on and founded an organization which at the time was called Andover Educators, but since we have changed and we now call it the Association for Body Mapping Education. And our mandate is to teach the art of movement in music. So we teach musicians how to move according to the design of their body and not according to some of the mythologies that are floating around out there in our culture and sometimes in music pedagogy. So we want to stress to our students that musicians are movers. If you put a group of dancers or athletes in a room, let's stick with the dancers for a minute, put on some video footage of people dancing and let the dancers in the room watch the video footage. And then you ask them, what do you see? And they will invariably come up with movement words, but not musicians. If you do the same experiment with musicians and ask them what they see, they will frequently say, I see they're entertaining an audience, or they are expressing themselves, or they are interpreting the composer. And it's a long time before they start saying, well, yeah, I guess actually they're moving. And it's because, of course, our movements might be smaller. We're not throwing ourselves over, the high jump pole. So we have to stress to our students, first of all, that movement is really, really important. Because the integrity of our sound depends entirely on the integrity of our movement. And there is such a thing as high quality movement or poor quality movement. And that's partly what we're going to be talking about today, how this can really help us in online teaching. So make sure from the outset that you're teaching your students about their sense of kinesthesia, because they, just like all of us, were taught that we had 5 senses when we were little people, and we were not shown this sixth sense that is all about our sense of movement and where we are in space. So just to kind of drive home what we mean by our sense of kinesthesia, because it's something we use all day long, but because we've never been taught to refine it in the way that musicians refine their auditory sense, we're sometimes not very good at using it. So I'd love it if you could cover your own square so that you don't see yourself for this next little experiment. Or you just flip on, onto the next group of people so that you're not looking at yourself. I'd like you all to please put a hand in the air behind your head so that you cannot see it, and start moving it around while you watch the other people, and notice that their hand is moving very differently from yours. Remember, you're not looking at yours. And then freeze into position and do the same thing, and notice that your hand is in a different position than the people around you. I can tell you now without looking that my pinky is pointing down towards my palm and my index finger is pointing up. So we can bring our arms down, and then we ask ourselves, how did we all know what our fingers were doing up there? We weren't touching them, so it wasn't a tactile sense, and we weren't looking at them. That is our kinesthetic sense, and our sense receptors are all of the connective tissues that live at the joints of the body, and they are communicating with the brain back and forth constantly, back from the movement map, which lives up in the brain. So that's a very, very brief run through of what your kinesthesia is, but do use that exercise with your students, because it may surprise them how much information they do have access to about how they're moving. Okay, so a little bit about online teaching. I wanted to include this thought before we started because I have certainly dealt with my share of frustration in the beginning. We have to adjust our expectations. If you go into online teaching expecting to use the same tool set that you do in person teaching, then it is going to be frustrating. Now I figured out that there's a wonderful opportunity afforded to us presently in this strange time to add a whole bunch of new skills to our skill set, so that it is not just what we're used to doing, what we were trained in music school to do, which is to use our ears. So here are some of the specific challenges that I know we're all dealing with. Poor sound quality. These crazy delays that we get between the visual and the audio. So I'm encouraging you all to start using your eyes more. Sometimes the delay is bad enough and it drives my brain crazy. I just turn the sound off, but I can still teach because I can see the quality of movement that's happening, and I know exactly what I need to do to guide that student into a better sound through their movement. So throughout the presentation, you'll see little red flags. That's just flagging for you some really common poor quality movement patterns that we see in a lot of musicians, so that you know what you're looking for and you know that that's something that needs to be addressed from a movement standpoint. Another challenge is this lack of ensemble playing. When students are playing in an ensemble, they are deriving their sense of rhythm and beat from the baton, sometimes from the drummer in the group, sometimes from the bass line. And when that's taken away, what I'm going to encourage you to do to help your students foster and improve their sense of rhythm is to work on their breathing with them, the movement of breathing. There are so many fallacies out there about what the body is supposed to do in breathing. What's really interesting is that anybody who has a poor sense of rhythm, I'll guarantee you that they are using unnecessary muscular work in order to try to breathe, because the breath is our natural rhythm. It's the rhythm that we were born with from the very first moment. So if we can return people to their birthright of really healthy breathing, then I promise you that students' rhythm will improve. Finally, one frustration is if we're a music teacher who is used to guiding physically the movements of students. For instance, I teach Suzuki violin, and boy, am I ever used to being able to take the person's arm and move the bow to help them find a straighter bow. But there are ways to do that without guiding physically. And what I loved about Barbara's teaching was that even though she was an Alexander Technique teacher, and even though she was in the room with us, she still chose the Socratic method. She would ask all of us questions about how it felt in our own body. And that gave us ownership and motivation. We weren't just moving in a certain way because we were told to, we were moving that way because it felt good in our bodies. And we could feel that it felt better than what we were doing before. So I'm going to coach you through just some sample questions that you can be asking your students when you see some funny movement going on that you want them to start addressing. I'm going to walk you through the kind of the three phases that I think of when we talk about the method of body mapping, so you kind of understand how it's done. And we're going to use the arm as an example. So the first step is simply observing the movement and asking yourself, is it free? Does it look free or does it look restricted? Here's your red flag over here. If you, for instance, are a band director and you see a trombonist trying to get to 7th position and they're moving out, but they're not letting any movement happen in the collarbone shoulder blade unit, that's restricted movement. If you're a violinist teaching a violin student and they're trying to come to the frog and it's kind of cramped and hunched up like that, that's restricted movement. So first of all, just identifying what it is that you're seeing. Then we have to access the map for them. We have to help them access what is the misconception that's causing that kind of strange restricted movement. And we're going to do that by asking a question. So the first question I would ask a person doing that kind of movement is, if this is the bottom of your arm down here, can you point to where the top of your arm is? Just show me where you think the top of your arm is. Invariably, somebody who's hunching and restricting movement up there will point to this part of the arm up here. And immediately you think to yourself, aha, we've uncovered the mismapping. They have not included the collarbone and the shoulder blade as a moving part of their arm. And that's why the sound is going to be restricted, because the movement is restricted and there's unnecessary muscular holding. So in order to free that so that the movement looks and feels easy and sounds resonant, we need to help them with a few tools. So the first tool I recommend you get for your studio is a Barbie doll. This is very useful, especially on online teaching. I like to take her, she happens to be in a bathing suit. I found the model of the Barbie in her bathing suit. And I like to take her swimming and just show them what she looks like when she does the front crawl stroke. And invariably, everybody giggles because it looks so bizarre. So they know somewhere instinctively that that is not the way we move when we do the front crawl. The next step is to actually try that movement on. So I have them put their fingers on their collarbone and try to imitate Barbie. And don't let that collarbone move. You can go ahead and try this with me. Don't let the collarbone move. And notice that you'll get nowhere near a front crawl stroke. You might have a doggy paddle out of that. And then we do the full front crawl, and they feel how much movement the collarbone and the shoulder blade unit has. So I'm just going to flash this model at you. Two separate bones, but they work as a unit. If we want the shoulder blade to move, there has to be movement at the collarbone where it joins the sternum. And in body mapping, we call that arm joint number 1. So we've just started to help them correct the misconception in their map because we've shown them anatomical images and models. We've palpated, which means feeling a bone with your fingers to give them information about it in their own body. And we've taken them into a movement exploration, both in a restricted way and then comparing that to a freer way. Most people have not lost that movement in their front crawl stroke if they started swimming lessons when they were younger. And finally, we can help people remap an area of the body by giving them some modeling on beautiful players. So I'm going to show you a bit of Anne-Sophie Mutter. She's doing the A major violin concerto here, but I'm going to zip over to the slow movement. And I want you to watch how her whole arm moves when she goes to the frog of the bow. So just make sure I'm on the right. Yeah, that should do it, I think. I want you to take special notice that she's kind of, when she floats up, you should be able to see right into her armpit region because the whole collarbone shoulder blade unit is floating up. So just have a little watch here. See how free that is. the whole arm unit is moving up together, collarbone and shoulder blade. There we go. So many music students are really good at imitating, and this is a fantastic, very, very quick way to help somebody remap their movement for whole arm free movement. So especially online learning, boy, oh boy, what a great thing to be able to just get some YouTube videos. And as long as you're really confident that this person is moving well, you should be sharing that with your students. Now, no one ever told Anne-Sophie Mutter that she should get her shoulders down, clearly, because they're moving really, really freely. People who do hold their shoulders down because maybe they've been taught that are at risk of having chronically cold hands and potentially numbness. This is a little injury I wanted to throw in here that we want to avoid. The nerves and blood vessels that run down to your hands run between the collarbone and the top rib, right in here. So if we are purposely holding down that collarbone, we are really going to be doing ourselves in. So we want to make sure that we're avoiding that with our students, and that we start finding new language instead of talking about getting shoulders down. Obviously, we don't want them hunching, but we're going to teach them the sequence of beautiful whole arm movement. So that's what I want to share with you next. So we're going to delve a little deeper. The next question you'd ask this person is, well, okay, so you've got a whole arm mapped now. What do you think your upper arm bone meets at the shoulder joint? And somebody who is still struggling with this will say, oh, I know, it's a ball and socket joint. And they'll make that gesture. And you can say, well, it's true, there is a socket there, but it looks nothing like this claw. That kind of person will probably imagine that the shoulder blade is something separate on the back of their body, and that there's this fantasy socket over at the side, which is completely separate from a shoulder blade. So we have to show them an image about the truth of it. We show them that contained within the side of a shoulder blade, there is a socket. So in other words, the socket is the shoulder blade. We can look at it from the front. There's the socket and there's the ball sitting in it. And we can find it from the back. I'd like you all to find the tip of your shoulder blade on yourself. And this is something you can do with your students. So wiggle that shoulder blade around. And then when you found the tip, walk up the outside edge of it here, because it's in the back of the armpit. And I'm going to put a little red X there. And we really, really want your students to be feeling where those two bones are meeting. That's the closest we can get to palpating a socket. So when they're moving, they can feel that that socket is moving along with the rest of their arm. There's a wonderful analogy and a new little toy suggestion I'm going to make here. If you can get yourself a toy train and a caboose, this is terrific for teaching children online, that to teach this whole arm movement, the analogy is that this part of your arm is the train because it should lead the movement, and this part of your arm is the socket and is the caboose, excuse me. So we never want a caboose pushing the train, right? The caboose should be following. If the caboose is pushing the train, then it's going to look movement like that. You're going to be initiating it from up here. We don't want that. A caboose also should never be pulling in the opposite direction from the train, which is what happens when people are using muscles to try to hold this part of the arm down, and then other muscles to try to take this part of the arm forward to raise an instrument. That causes a lot of strain, was my original injury. And it also, in some people who are susceptible and stretchy in their ligaments, it can cause dislocations at that joint. So it's quite a serious thing, and we want to make sure that we get that order right so that this part of the arm leads movement and the shoulder blade follows, simply because they're joined together like a train and a caboose. And then you can show them a video of that. So go ahead and try this as you're sitting there at home. See what that's like. Can you imitate what you see here? Notice that as soon as this bone starts to move, the shoulder blade comes along with it. And I want you to also notice that when we go up to the ceiling, I'm just going to pause this for a second. When we get all the way up there, the collarbone starts to get quite a bit higher on this end. And for any upper string players who are in the room, this is a godsend, because on the left side, what that means is that we have this built-in elevator that helps elevate the violin into the jawbone. And without putting a violin there and then shoving it up, this would be an example of the caboose pushing the train. So if we get the train leading the caboose, we have this beautiful elevated perch for the violin to sit on, and that relieves a lot of strain and tension also in the neck muscles. So this is easily found online. Banda Yoga was this particular website that published this beautiful anatomical little movie of it was almost like having a moving x-ray. The fancy term for this is humeral scapular rhythm. That's what neurophysiology calls it, but you don't need to tell that to your students. You just taught the train and the caboose. So we're going to move on into breathing, because there's two other issues I want to cover before we start the questions. The question you need to ask somebody, if you ask somebody, for instance, to take a deep breath and they make this movement, you know right away that they have a misconception of where their lungs are, that they're thinking that their lungs live only in the front, when in fact there is actually more lung tissue that lives in the back half of the torso. If you ask them where the movement of breathing occurs, it's very likely that they're going to say, oh, it's here in the front, and my diaphragm is here in the front, and I have to diaphragm breathe, or I have to belly breathe. All of this stuff is very front oriented when we have so much more lung back here. So we have to explain to them, first of all, that the first step in finding really free breathing, and this is not just to improve our rhythm, obviously, this is also for singers and choral directors and wind players and brass players, understanding the real mechanics of breathing. I'm just going to bring my camera down so you can see my ribs. I'd like you all to just place your hands on your ribs like I'm doing. And I want you to watch mine, and you'll notice that on my next inhale, my hands are going to get pushed away from one another. And this is something you can guide your students to do all on their own. You don't have to be there with your own hands on them. So here's the inhale. And that is a 360-degree movement. I am feeling movement under my thumbs in the back and at the sides and in the front. And that is because that the ribs are moved by these muscles, and they swing from their joints with the spine at the side. Sometimes we say that it swings like a bucket handle, like that, if this was my bucket. And they're a lot more tilted though. You'll notice how much higher they are in the back than in the front. They stretch from cartilage in the front, and they pivot at their joint at the back. And that gives us a whole lot of really conscious control over our breathing, if we know how to move those ribs up very quickly or down very slowly for a long phrase. But the most important thing I want to drill today for this issue of making people feel their own natural inherent rhythm better is that it is a 360-degree experience. So not just in the ribs. This is what happens when the ribs move, and the diaphragm, I'll show you this little video in a second. The diaphragm is kind of like moves in tandem with the ribs. We have very few sense receptors though to the diaphragm. So this idea of making your diaphragm do something is a little bit mythical, because I have learned recently that free divers apparently have learned how to control their diaphragm, and I think yogis also. But for musicians, we need to know about the ribs anyway. So let's just get that feeling of 360-degree expansion in the ribs, and that will get the diaphragm moving well, as long as we're not trying to push out with our belly. The reason that there is movement in the lower abdomen, ideally front, sides, and back, when we inhale, is that the diaphragm is pushing itself down, and it displaces all of the organs and intestines. But if we're trying to do something with our belly muscles, then it's going to actually prevent the diaphragm from its full excursion. So before I play it, and you're going to try it along, you're going to take some breaths and mimic what you see here. I just want you to understand how air gets into the lungs. We don't have to suck it in by tightening our neck muscles. That was F.M. Alexander's initial discovery, what was causing tension for him, trying to suck air in noisily. So we don't need to do that. We just need to move our ribs. If we move our ribs up and out, the black area here, which is the lung, You will see it getting bigger, being stretched up by the movement of the upward ribs and down by the downwards excursion of the diaphragm. So the lung gets really, really big. It kind of gets stretched out, and the air pressure drops inside. And nature being what it is, air pressure wants to always equalize. So air rushes in from outside the body inside the lung. So we are basically breathed when we move our ribs up. It's a very indirect process, but it works beautifully when we get it moving. So put your hands back on your ribs, please. And notice that these little white bits are the ribs, black is the lung, and this is your diaphragm with your intestines getting displaced. And just watch this beautiful movement a few times. So here comes a really big inhalation you can try. And then on the exhale, the diaphragm just releases itself back up again. Let's watch that one more time so you have a chance to feel a very shallow breath first, and then a really deep one. And we want to be feeling that in the back, and we want to be feeling the ribs moving up high underneath the shoulder blades, which is why it's important, again, to have free arm structure. It's very important for our brass and wind players and singers, because if these ribs are being depressed by arms that are being pulled down, we're not going to get that air. So the toy I would like to recommend is called a flexahedron, and some of you I'm sure have seen it before, but it's a lovely toy to help students understand that 360-degree nature of expansion, and then on the exhale how it returns. So our inhale looks like this. Go ahead and breathe in and see if you can feel as much movement in the back of your body as in your front. And then we exhale. And of course, when we breathe well and we're releasing unnecessary muscular tension, we feel calmer. And that also helps with feeling the rhythm in the phrase. So my last point before we go to questions has to do with standing and sitting. This, of course, is, you can show people pictures of this and ask them what they all have in common, and it's fairly obvious. Your red flag over here is that they're all arching in their lower back. They're all pushing forward like that. And another way to describe it is that they're using a spinal movement to raise their instrument. So kind of like that, leaning backwards, instead of using free arms from arm joint number 1. So this is a spine mismapping that we have to address in our students. And the questions that you're going to ask them to kind of, sort through what they're feeling is, where is your spine? And most people will, especially if they're doing that, they'll be hyper aware of their back because it's going to be tired and hurting probably. And so they're probably going to point to the back. In our culture, back and spine are used interchangeably. People say he's going in for back surgery, where actually they're going in because a disc has slipped, and sometimes they're actually mending a disc. If it's up high, they're mending it from the front. So it's not interchangeable. And the thing to know about the spine is that in the front half, which is a much bigger portion, like if somebody points here as their spine, that's the tip of the iceberg. This part in front is much, much bigger, and it has the advantage of having all these beautiful cushiony discs between each vertebrae, which is a great place to be sending our weight down through in this upright column that we live around. We don't want to be sending it down the back half because there are no cushions. It's just kind of bone on bone. There's a little bit of connective tissue, but there's no nice, fat, juicy cushion in between. So the first thing you want to do is show your students, if they pointed right across their pelvis here, and if their fingers could continue on in, they would run into bone, into the front of their spine. Your intestines and guts nestle right in front and around that front part of the spine. It's buried deep within you. And when people find that, they can start letting go of some of that holding that they tend to do in their lower back and stop that arching. One thing that just came to me as I was telling you about that was a really funny story about Barbara. Sometimes she'd get a younger student in front of her. She'd ask a question like, well, tell me how big you think your spine is. And their first default answer is always, oh, I don't know. And she would often say, well, if you did know, what would your answer be? She wouldn't let people get away with just shrugging it off and saying, oh, I'm not sure, I don't know. She insisted, and it was such a wonderful gift she gave all of us. She insisted that we did know, somewhere in our brain we knew about our body and what we were feeling in our body. So I encourage you to really make sure that you're helping your students dig deep to find out what they're feeling in their body. So we want our weight coming down that front part of the spine. And one of the best ways I've found to get people releasing that lower back holding is to actually start from sitting, because it eliminates some of the complications and compensations that the leg joints do. And I like to put stickers on the front of my bony modeled pelvis. I often put little happy faces right here. And I tell them that if they're arching in their lower back, those eyes or happy faces are going to be looking down at the floor. So go ahead and try sitting up straight. And there's nothing straight about that. We're usually really putting a huge curve in the lower spine. That pushes those eyes, that front of the pelvis, down, looking at the floor. And if you just ask them to let those eyes look out straight out at the world, that is one way of helping them undo some of that tension and holding. The other way, I'm just going to stop sharing here for a minute so you can see me a little bit larger on the screen, because we're going to do this in our chairs together. And once again, the joy of body mapping is that you can guide somebody to move their own body into balance. It does not have to be something that you do with your hands like we do quite often do in a music lesson. So I want you to place one hand on your lower back and feel what the muscles, we're kind of looking for the muscles on either side of your spine. And I want you to purposely go into that really horrible arching that people call sitting up straight, or they might call it good posture. And I want you to notice under your hand that those muscles right on either side of your spine have gone, they're kind of running the lengthwise of your spine, have gone hard, or maybe they feel a bit ropey. And then what I'd like you to do is place a hand on the front of your pelvis here, and just very gently, while you're still monitoring in the back, you're very gently just going to nudge the front of the pelvis back, 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 until you feel the muscles underneath your fingers starting to soften. You're going to feel that that big arch has come out of the lower spine, and that is going to help people figure out exactly where they need to be on their sit bones. There are many other ways that you can guide somebody through where they should be on their sit bones. One is simply to show them what it looks like on a model, but not everybody is going to have a model like this to show. But it's very useful to understand that the part that we perch on is much thicker bone than the stuff up here. This is where we end up if we're trying to sit up straight. And some people will say, oh, I hate sitting up straight because my sit bones hurt if they're on a hard piano bench. But they won't hurt if they're back on the thicker bone. Notice that these 2 points are much further apart, which gives us more stability also in our sitting. So by learning how to sit that way and release those muscles, we can extrapolate from there and then help them to find that same sensation in their standing when they're playing. So I think we have just maybe one last slide before we go to questions. And that, I believe, is just going to be a review. Yeah, so just to summarize that, if we use our eyes to observe quality of movement rather than just thinking about quality of sound, we will indirectly be creating a better sound because better movement creates it. If we get our students breathing better, their rhythm is going to be way more reliable. And if we teach students about their kinesthesia and ask them questions about what they're feeling in their body and use those as our guideposts for how we're going to teach them next, whatever their answers are, then they get ownership of their movement and they start to recognize what it feels like when they're moving easily and when they're tensed. So we will move to questions now. And here is some more contact information for both myself and for GIA and for our body mapping organization. And if I'll just leave this screen up maybe for just a moment. If anybody wants to take a look at those resources, they can quickly copy those down. So, Alec, if you want to unmute, I don't know if you have any questions that are already there that you want to pursue.
Yes, we have Terrence Bacon asks, what do you recommend for reed players? We call it the clarinet knot that forms under the right lower shoulder near the spine center. Hard to describe. And if you have, Terrence, if you want to add anything, you can unmute yourself and.
Go ahead, Terrence. Just tell me a little bit more about what you're wondering.
Sure. So, am I off?
Yeah, we hear you.
Perfect. So both my wife jokingly, we call it the clarinet, that it's towards the upper part of the body, right underneath the shoulder muscle towards the knot. And just from playing, it seems, I'm a sax player, she's a clarinet player, that just seems to be a common problem that we run into. So we're trying to figure out, all right, what are we doing wrong, and how can we adjust that for both ourselves and our students?
Great. Would you say that it's under the shoulder blade or in between the shoulder blades?
More in between the shoulder blades, just to the right of center, right underneath that back shoulder muscle.
Okay. Without seeing you moving, I'm just going to throw out my main instinct here, because we see this a lot in violin players too, is that when arms come up to raise an instrument, remember we were talking about how people tend to tilt the whole torso back. The other thing that happens is that shoulder blades get pulled together. That's part of what we call the good posture disease. If you were ever told to sit up straight, often that military style, came into it, and people pull their shoulders back. That kind of pain that you're talking about is usually residual from maybe having learned that when you were very, very young, even away from the clarinet. But certainly then you add the weight of an instrument on top of that, and those muscles are holding on very tightly. So all of that work we did at the beginning with Anne-Sophie Mutter, remember how we were watching her move and how the whole arm structure was moving as she went? That would be something to practice in your daily life away from the clarinet. Every time you reach for a glass of orange juice or the salt shaker or going up to the top shelf, wherever you're reaching, just making sure that the shoulder blade is traveling and isn't getting lodged down onto your back as if it was a part of your back. Okay. Because it's way more a part of your arm than it is a part of your back. Does that make sense, Terrence?
I believe it does, yeah, because the right hand is that's the holding arm for us. So it tends to come forward or be pushing the horn forward for the sax players.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we could probably spend a whole hour, on that particular issue. But if you, and again, that's why we've written all this stuff down in books, is that I would encourage you to go read about it a little bit and see if you can, figure out some more of the details. And I'm always happy to see people privately too, if you'd like more information on that.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Terry. Next, we have a question from Laura Nuremberg, and you're unmuted, Laura. So
thank you. Hi, Jennifer. Nice to see you again.
Hi, Laura. Nice to see you too.
So I have a question. You said something very quickly about the left side of a violinist and the elevator, and it just went by really, really fast. Could you just elaborate just for a moment on that?
Yes, I certainly can. If everybody's okay with the resource page, I'm going to stop sharing there so that you can see me a little bit more larger than life, or at least almost as large as life. I talk to my students a lot about, especially if they're younger, I take a tiny little doll and I place it on their collarbone, and I show them how that collarbone is like an elevator. So we take that little guy for a ride and we go up to 10th floor, and we say, we never play the violin on 10th floor, that would be ridiculous. And we bring it back down to the side and we say, oh, we brought him back down to first floor, but we never play the violin on first floor. We take it to the basement, which is actually pulling down on it, which is a perfectly valid movement, we don't want to get stuck there. We say we never play the violin in the basement. So then we go back up to 10th floor and slowly bring it down and say, really great range is between, the 4th floor to maybe the 8th floor. So we're giving them, a way to kind of compare all of these different little increments of where that collarbone ends up. And then, because I'll just grab my violin, because the the collarbone is now elevated in a natural way, not like what you'll see a lot of players doing, which is they slap the violin up there and then they feel insecure with the violin, and so then they end up rolling the whole left side into it, like in a movement that's like that. That's also going to push the head forward and cause a lot of neck tension. So this is just a healthy humeroscapular rhythm. We take it to a really far extreme, and then we bring it back so that the collarbone, you can, I'm just lying my finger along mine right now, it's on an angle about like that. So instead of being down here parallel to the floor, I've allowed it to follow the rest of my arm, so the socket, there's no strain between the socket and the ball. Plus, the violin has been elevated about 1.5 inches closer to my jaw. And now, assuming that you do have the right height chin rest, which is a whole other story. There are some really wonderful chin rest fitters who, you know, will tell you exactly how much height you need there. But then you can find a really free place to be playing from, as long as you don't get stuck in a place. That range between 4th and 8th floor is important, that it's something that's always moving. Does that help, Laura?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. Jennifer, Gay Thomas asks, she's a piano teacher, can you use breathing to help keep a steady beat from measure to measure?
Well, yes. Your first chore, though, will be exactly what we were talking about earlier in the session, is just making sure that the quality of breathing is, you know, when we talked about this guy here, that it really is happening without muscular holding or false, you know, trying to pushing out from the belly. So that's the first step. There are all sorts of things you can do with the breath, depending on what your instrument is, to help build the rhythm into a breath. I'll speak as a string player first, that when I was learning this, I spent quite a bit of time just breathing in for 4 counts, making sure that it was a really healthy breath, that the movement was good, and then breathing out for 4 counts. And so I had my breath was like this one large beat, or one large measure, if you like, and I was subdividing in between. Now, we're not always going to be breathing like that. Singers have to do it, of course, only on the exhale. They make their music only on the exhale. But pianists and violinists can be breathing in or out, as long as it's healthy movement. And we have consciously taken that healthy movement and trained in subdivisions within that beautiful larger gesture of the whole torso expanding, then it becomes a really organic thing. And I mean, I would imagine there'd be lots of, you know, creativity at the piano. You could say that, you know, we're going to play, we're going to feel, you know, 4 notes in 4 beats in a measure, and that will be on the inhale. And then we'll maybe that would be an arpeggio coming up, and then you come down the arpeggio while you're breathing out. You know, you I'm sure can make those applications, but that's how I would go about doing it, is finding smaller subdivisions in between one large healthy breath. Is that helpful?
Thank you. Great. So Debbie Falco asks, I'm having trouble with tennis elbow in my bow arm. I'm getting physical therapy, and I had a cortisone shot in her arm 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
Do you have any tips or stretches you recommend that she do?
This is a biggie, and I purposely didn't put it in the slideshow because I could go on forever about it, but let me see if I can do this in 30 seconds or less. This is actually a left arm I'm showing you, but you can extrapolate. There are 2 forearm bones. They each have completely different functions. The one that runs up the pinky side is the bending one.
Okay.
It's a hinge. The one that runs up the thumb side is the rotating bone. You see how beautifully that rotates up here?
Yes. Yes.
And it takes the whole hand and wrist with it when we do that. You'll
Okay.
notice that this bone is completely stationary.
Yes.
That's good. When people get tendonitis or any kind of tennis or golf elbow, it is always, and I think after 16 years, I can say this confidently, it is always that this bone is trying to get in on the action of turning from side to side.
Okay.
So we need to practice. What I usually do is have people draw on a piece of paper, draw 2 lines on either side of the forearm with the hand palm up.
Okay.
Then leave that bone that runs underneath the pinky side. They leave that bone on its line, and they practice keeping it on the table. You have to be on a table to do this.
Okay.
And they let the other bone do the rotation instead of the wrong way, which looks like that. See that twisting that's happening when I do that? You see what it does to a hand and a wrist? So that, I mean, again, that could be a whole hour, but is that enough information to get started with? I hope so.
Great.
Okay, great.
Let's see. So Victor Gaspar asks, for singers, it looks like the breathing out would be helped, the apagio in Italian, by the abdominal muscles. Breathing out should be helped by the abdominal muscles. The problem is that sometimes we do it too much strongly. By asking questions, what kind of questions can we ask the singers for them to be more free?
Well, I would start with that question that I posed earlier, which is, where do you think the movement of breathing is? And if they immediately go to the abdominal muscles, then you know that they have not learned enough about 360-degree rib movement. So that would be my first piece of advice, is just to make sure that they know that their direct control to their brain is from the muscles that live between the ribs. There are lots of techniques in singing and lower brass, I know, where my body mapping colleagues say that occasionally that it is necessary to engage some of those abdominal muscles. But they also stress that it's way less, as you stated in your question, way less than what many people are trying to use. It's only maybe at the very end of an exhale to just help a little bit more air come out. So I'm not a singer, and I would, beyond that, I would say definitely go read the books that the singers have written. Barbara wrote a wonderful book called the Structures and Movement of Breathing, which is for choral singers. But I would go read the really detailed work about that. But always go to the ribs first.
Great.
Thank you. I have that book. Thank you.
Great.
Devin Bennett asks, when playing the piano, how may I effectively achieve relaxed shoulders without holding the shoulders down?
Okay. We're getting all the singers. Yay. All right. I'm going to show you one other tool that is an essential. And even if your students can't get to the hardware store to cut up this is pipe insulation from the hardware store, right? Plumbing section. Even if they can't get there in these bizarre times, you can ask them to take a pair of socks and roll them each up separately and put them in the armpit region. So I'm going to demonstrate by placing that under the arms. It's one of the quickest ways to teach students and yourself where neutral is. So where we're not holding them up and we're also not pulling them down on top of the ribs. There is a place where they drape naturally through the stretchy connective tissues of the body. And this basically acts like a spacer that you put between your toes when you get a pedicure. You know, the little foamies that spread the bones apart. That's what these are for. And the idea is not that we're squeezing it or holding it there. The idea is that it's passively repelling the inside of the arm away from the side of the torso, while also giving some upwards lift, a little bit of artificial upwards lift. And then these muscles can just very softly drape down over top of that upwards force coming from your prop, whatever your prop is. I'll tell you that I have just finished writing the first draft of another book that is about shoulders and this very topic, a whole book on how to find release and neutral for the upper arm structure. So whenever that's published, you can get some more details about that. But actually the What Every Violinist book also has quite a bit of information about neutral for the arms.
Great. Another question from Sarah McLean. She says, for singers, when I ask a singer to notice the arch in their back, when they fix it, they often then collapse the sternum and their head and neck comes forward. What might be some helpful vocabulary and techniques to counteract that?
Okay. Two important things that have to happen together, because you're right. We take one compensation away and then this happens at the top of the body. So backwards walking is incredibly useful to find that a natural release in that arch in standing. We only talked about sitting earlier, but if you do that same thing with the hand on the back and walk backwards, you will notice that there'll be some release there. This is not new. Alexander technique teachers have been using this for eons. As for the head, you have to kind of teach these things separately and then bring them together. Go ahead, everybody, and just pick up something that a book, or you just need a sentence, one sentence to read quietly to yourself. Go ahead and read. It might be on your cell phone. It might be a text. I don't know, just something. And after you've done that, I want you to place a hand on the back of your head. And you're going to let that hand sink into the back of your head as if it was in a memory foam mattress. Because in a moment, when you bring your hand down, you're going to feel that imprint still there, like the memory foam holds it. This is the most important part of this exercise, is that you really feel where the back of the skull is in space and that you're aware of it. And with that awareness keenly in your consciousness, go ahead and read a second time and see what changes. Now, I won't take the time to ask everybody, but I can already see it in the few squares I'm looking at that almost everybody, the reading material floats up higher in front of us. And that's simply because we drew awareness to a part of the body that tends to get forgotten about because the face and the eyes are in the front. So you found more balance for a head, you released neck muscles just by bringing awareness to a part of your body we usually forget about. And so that's what I would say for that singer is after you can have them do some backwards walking while they're thinking of the back of their head. And it is amazing the kind of sound that comes out of a singer when they find that kind of release in the torso muscles.
Great. Susan Laurentio, maybe this is the same answer. She says, do you have a favorite exercise for the neck to release tension?
That is that is absolutely my favorite exercise. There's lots of, I mean, you can also, if your hands are clean, you can put a finger under your teeth and a hand on the back of the head and find that fulcrum, like the nodding joint is behind the earlobes. And you can actually passively, let your head be passive and move actively with your hands. So that people can really, really sense the delivery of that 10-pound head up there coming down through a vertical bones here, rather than all of the neck muscles having to grab on and hang on to this. I call it the bowling ball head because it's as heavy as a 10-pound bowling ball.
Great.
So that's another little idea.
Great. One more question, and then we'll have to wrap because we're just about at the end of our hour. David Fiedler says, for students whose elbow is too low as they approach the frog, do you have a suggestion for helping them come up higher without them getting fatigued?
The only, hi David, by the way, the only reason that you would get fatigued is if you've got some muscles that are pulling down, maybe I'll just use the bow, at the same time as there are some muscles that are trying to take the arm up and forward. If there are some muscles back here that are still yanking down on the arm, that's when fatigue happens, because it's like a tug of war. There are some muscles that are pulling in one direction and others are going in another. So one thing I do is called scooping, and you can teach students to do this remotely, and that is to actually get their hand, this muscle is called latissimus dorsi, starts at the top of the pelvis and attaches to the underside of the arm. So when those muscle fibers shorten, it yanks down on the arm, and that's one of the most common ones. So if there's fatigue there, my first guess, without seeing somebody, would be to say that they need to be practicing coming to the frog of the bow while they're manually asking those muscles by scooping, just kind of asking those muscles to slide over the ribs instead of yanking down in the wrong direction. And you can do that with and without a bow in your hand. The arms generally feel much lighter and freer when we remove some of that tug of war.
Great. Thanks so much, Jennifer. So I think one of the questions, and if helpful, one of the things we thought about if folks do have questions, Jennifer said that she'd be very happy to have office hours. Basically, folks can come online and check in with her next Friday at 10 a.m. Central Time. I will we'll send a Zoom announcement. You can look at our Facebook page for information about all of that. I want to thank Jennifer so much for the very helpful hour, and thank all of you for participating. We did put the link to the coupon code for 10% off, which is all lowercase BodyMap 2020 on the GI website. And again, thank you all so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you again. Take care.
Thank
Lovely
you,
to see you
Jennifer.
all. You're welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.